have already joined us, so we will be able to start. There are people from all over the world. I see people from Maldives, India, Nepal, Philippines, Myanmar, Kenya, Vietnam, and Laos, and a lot more. So I want to say good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, from according to where you are. Thank you very much for joining us in the margin of the Asia Pacific Climate Week. And we are very excited to launch with you today UNEP's new publication, A Practical Guide to Climate Resilience Buildings and Communities. Next slide, Jacob, please. So before starting with the first session, you can now access the report on UNEP website. The access link should appear on your screen, and it will also be shared on the chat. We strongly encourage you to upload the report and have a look at it now or later today. So here's what will be discussed during the webinar. I will start by providing an overview of the context in which the report was commissioned by UNEP, and I will talk about what makes it unique and critical. Then Jacob Alcombe from S Efficiency, who is also the coordinating author of the report, will be introducing the structure and the content of the practical guide. He will be followed by the report's author, Dr. Mitul Vanvati from RMIT University, and Dr. Rajat Gupta from Oxford Brookes University, who will be introducing some of the solutions for resilience building by looking at concrete case studies from Asia Pacific. And those will include some interesting examples of nature-based solutions. And to finish, you will have some time to ask your questions before we close the session. Next slide, please. So let me start by providing some background and context. The impacts of climate change, including heat waves, droughts, floods, and cyclones, are increasingly affecting the built environment and in turn the society as a whole. So over the last decades, there has been a worldwide average of 361 disasters per year. Those disasters affected approximately 91 million people in 2019 alone. And in 2020, those disasters produced global losses of around $210 billion. And this is expected to get worse in the coming years. So recent research predicted that by 2050, 1.6 billion urban dwellers will be exposed to extreme high temperatures, and over 800 million people will be vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding. And most of them will be living in cities that are located in developing countries. So this leads to rapidly growing adaptation needs. If we look at actual adaptation costs for the developing world alone, they are estimated to be currently at $70 billion per year. And this number is going to increase to reach an estimated $300 billion per year by 2030. As a point of comparison, in 2018, adaptation finance going to developing countries represented around $16.8 billion. So this shows that this is definitely not enough to cover the needs. And to close the adaptation gap, we need to redirect resources and efforts to climate change adaptation. And to do so in an effective and successful way, we need to generate additional knowledge on good practices. And it is in this context that UNEP decided to commission a study to support its member states to integrate adaptation in the buildings and construction sector. Next slide, please. So why did we decide to focus on the buildings and construction sector? Because buildings can be key drivers of vulnerability. When they are ill-suited to their local environment and when they are strongly exposed to extreme climate conditions, they largely contribute to high human and economic losses. And on the other side, we also see that when smartly designed and constructed, buildings can ensure the safety and well-being of their residents, and they can actually protect them against climate change impacts. A World Bank study shows that investing in more resilient infrastructure could save humanity more than $4.2 trillion. And another study that has been recently published shows that adopting the latest building codes produced by the International Code Council would allow to save on average $11 per dollar invested, which makes it a very cost-efficient adaptation measure. Next slide, please. So a few words about the report itself. It is a user-friendly, forward-looking guide for building resilience in the construction sector. It is the result of a close collaboration between UNEP Climate Change Adaptation Unit and UNEP Cities Unit. And it is also the result of a collaboration with a broad team of experts that are coming from different backgrounds, including academic and research world. It is focusing on concrete solutions. It provides ways in which buildings and community spaces can be constructed to increase resilience to impacts of climate events, including heat waves, floods, and storms. And it is tailored toward the developing country context and a built environment that is largely self-constructed. But all the proposed solutions in the guide can also be upscaled and applied to different building types. And it can be used for more formal settings, including apartment complexes, hospitals, or schools. To finish, a few words about the audience and the main use of key findings. So the practical guide is aimed for a broad audience, including for people with little experience in the building and construction industries. It is aimed for government line ministries, for development and adaptation practitioners, and also for community members. It will guide efforts to achieve SDG 1, 11, and 13, looking at ending poverty, building sustainable cities and communities, and mitigating climate change and its impact. All of those SDGs have targets around resilience and adaptation. And the aim of the report is also to be used to inform future adaptation programming and respond to the growing demand of UNEP member states regarding the need for additional support around urban adaptation and resilient buildings. It can also be used to support the national adaptation planning processes that are ongoing in several countries, with some including specific activities around updating and revising key building codes. So that's it for me and for the opening remarks. Thank you very much, and I will now let Jacob introduce the structure and the content of the report.
Thank you so much, Eva. Good to be with everyone today. I'm Jacob with Sufficiency, one of the coordinating authors on the project. I want to first thank the many other folks, the UNEP, for their support and their engagement on this important topic. And in academia, they often say that, our current research endeavors, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And I know that has been true for me, at least in the writing of this report, as I am grateful for the excellent work and the giant shoulders of Dr. Gupta and Dr. Vanavati, who are with us here today, as well as the other author, Julia Hagstrom, and the supporting authors and peer reviewers. Having done that, let's begin. As Eva has mentioned previously, the report's largely targeted to those in the development and adaptation community. However, the report or the guide attempts to serve as a bridge. So we aim to have included seeds of some technical information that will help support the conversations with people and other communities of expertise, such as architects, engineers, etc. We hope this is helpful. It was a bit of a challenge to balance those different needs, but I think we have been able to do that. We're also interested in sparking the collaboration and creativity and doing this via, as Eva mentions, tangible suggestions for ideas to draw upon, and that they can provide inspiration in your own relevant adaptation projects. Obviously, many of these ideas will need to be further explored and made relevant and applicable to the very specific conditions and the site needs of where your building projects are. The guide really focuses on fundamentals. We begin exploring design elements linked to key building components. So the building envelope, or that barrier between indoor space and the outdoor environment. Specifically also the roof, the structure of the building, the internal orientation, the internal layout of the building, the orientation of the building on the site, and we do explore some of the materials used in some of these projects. The guide also is pretty broad in geographic scope. We try to be applicable to built environments in a wider range of settings, but it's largely structured around the hot and arid, hot and humid, cold weather, and then also temperate environment by combining some of these suggestions. To aid the reader or those who are only specifically focused on areas that have heat waves or hot and humid climates, a number of icons have been added to the report to help identify sections or solutions or case studies that may be of interest to the reader. As you can see here, they're well defined in the report. Some of the key concepts in the overall guide structure is to really look at vulnerability and resilience. It's based on defined and existing literature and approaches. The guide tries to highlight the importance of gender and disadvantaged communities and the role buildings can play in securing those aspects. Design and construction approaches are presented in broad overview, again, for the non-building or construction experts. And we do touch on some special approaches, including passive design, frangible architecture, triage, and nature-based solutions. These are explored in greater detail in the report and touched on a bit later in the coming presentations. We look at thermal comfort and regulation. So that is your heat waves, your droughts, these increasing climatic risk due to the global warming. And strategies are highlighted for the hot and arid and hot and humid conditions for how to address this. We also look at heavy rainfall and floods, droughts, cyclones, and storms. These hazards are explored with potential approaches to mitigate risk via the building components I've mentioned earlier, the structure, the roof, and specific site measures. We also cover materials in some detail due to the important role that they play in helping to mitigate risk. And this is an area where there is some fairly technical information in the report to help with the discussions between the different practitioner communities. I just want to touch on some of the key summary recommendations towards the end of the report, and that resilient people equal resilient buildings, and that they really come together and hand in hand. And attention should be paid to the needs of the inhabitants and building users of all ages, gender, financial means, and physical ability. The buildings and risk reduction and adaptation really benefit from whole of life thinking. And that is not only for the buildings and the materials used in those buildings, but also where the development occurs, the design and orientation on the site, and then also looking forward into how the climate is expected to change. So that over that whole long life of a building. We also strongly encourage that the design and construction is locally rooted. It's important to consider the availability of materials, the availability of the local labor pool, the ecological health of the community, resource supply chains, skills and training, and these other things, so that the solutions that are proposed and adopted can be maintained and well adjusted to the local community. It's also important to have government goodwill, really government leadership on this, because one sector or one key actor can only do so much. There needs to be more done on the enabling frameworks for the broad uptake of action. Ava mentioned a bit on this earlier about the building codes, but it's also about the education outreach, incorporating architects, with the development community. Towards the conclusion of the report, we provide kind of a series of questions to help generate some thinking on any of your current projects. Considering the local climate, the expected climatic conditions, optimization of the building location to attempt to incorporate nature-based solutions, the shading, etc., design elements, and then some questions tied to materials. Again, the importance of incorporating local knowledge and strengthen that knowledge. Often buildings are assumed that they fail because we don't have access to the appropriate materials, but studies show that it's not really the case. Many of the buildings fail in the face of hazards because of insufficient knowledge in the monitoring and inspection of the construction, the misuse or misapplication of tools and materials, specific techniques that aren't well executed, or even not giving the building time itself enough time for the process of building. So giving concrete time to cure, and just the general construction process. That there's also a lot of benefit to international, national, and local engagement in the uptake and engagement, knowledge transfer of skills and development of trust within the community for incorporating these new measures. And that'll be touched on a bit as well in the coming presentation. I want to thank you now. I kind of rushed through this section because I'd like to share with you a short video that summarizes the report. So if you'll bear with me as I switch over to that.
The global climate is changing, and people everywhere are feeling the heat, and the increasing storms, and the rising floodwaters. These disastrous climate change impacts are especially severe for those living in developing countries. But our homes and our buildings can provide refuge from climate disasters. In fact, investing in well-designed, resilient buildings is one of the best ways of adapting to climate change. It can save, quite literally, trillions of dollars worth of damages. Let's look at some examples. Rising temperatures are leading to more heat waves and droughts, which impacts the soil and can damage foundations and building materials. Extended periods of heat also increase the likelihood of fire, posing a risk to people and their homes. To adapt, we can position buildings to capture the winds. Outer walls can be strategically built to channel cooling breezes indoors. Crucially, nature offers additional solutions. Plants can be grown around a building to provide shade, reducing indoor temperatures and making interior spaces more comfortable. Specific species, such as tall palms, are often an excellent choice, blocking the sun while allowing welcome breezes to pass through. Climate change is whipping up more intense storms, including cyclones and hurricanes, wreaking havoc on coastal communities. Buildings can be modified from the ground up into more wind-resistant shapes. Roofs can be redesigned with multiple slopes that perform better under wind forces. Connections between the walls and the roof can be reinforced with better, more secure attachments. Again, nature can provide solutions. Coastal ecosystems such as mangrove forests reduce wind speeds. They also limit coastal flooding caused by storm surges, as they can absorb the energy of the waves. Climate change is leading to unpredictable rainfall patterns in many parts of the world, resulting in floods that destroy homes. Since the start of the century, floods have affected more than 2 billion people. Again, we must rethink from the ground up. Homes in floodplains can be elevated on stilts, allowing floodwaters to pass underneath. Building materials must be properly chosen and matched to the site conditions, which will help the home stay drier. Nature can help too.
Hi, Jacob. I think the video has frozen for some of our guests. Would you like to just confirm that you can hear me? Okay. In that case,
I can hear.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, just Teams just restarted for some reason.
Okay, not to worry. We can just go over to Mittel Van Vatti if the rest of the video is not ready right now.
I think that's a good idea. The video will be available for everybody tomorrow.
Okay, Dr. Van Vatti, are you there?
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Thank you for the opportunity, Jacob and Marcus. My name is Mitul Vahanbhati, and I'm a lecturer at RMIT University. I lead climate change transformations research group there, and I also founded an early career researchers network to provide them a platform to do multidisciplinary research. I had founded a giant grass design studio with my husband, and am also a board member of a local neighborhood group. So I'm trained as an architect, practiced for 7 years in India, Switzerland, and Australia before moving into academia. And what brought me to academia was my passion for understanding the process of design and construction and how it could empower the people who are involved in the process. So not just leading to a hard built form, but also a soft outcome, that is community resilience outcome, which Jacob and Eva just described. This is one of the maps developed by the New York Times and 427, trying to showcase the areas in the world which will face multiple hazards. So these are the 3 regions that I have focused on my research and work so far: India, Solomon Islands, and Australia, the southern part, Melbourne, where I'm based. India, this is a map of risk index for multi-hazard in Asia-Pacific region, developed by OCHA. And as you can see, the red areas are the places which have extreme or major multi-hazard risk. So these were the 2 areas I had chosen during my PhD research, and I wanted to understand how the housing reconstruction after disaster leads to building community resilience in the long term. So in the Gujarat area of India, which borders Pakistan and has a little desert region in the top corner. It is a dry, arid area. And the traditional homes used to be mud, wattle and daub, mud plastered, circular buildings with thatch roof. In the earthquake, nothing happened to this typology of housing. But of course, it led to a lot of cracks, and with increasing drought, these sort of grasses are not readily available. So this was the second most deadliest earthquake registered in the history of India, and had massive impact. The local NGO went ahead and developed this design in close collaboration with the settlement owners, elders, women, and the form of the building was retained. The idea was to develop a multi-hazard safe house, not just a house that is safe from earthquake or drought tolerant, but also one that was good for cyclones. So this earthquake had followed 3 years of drought, so people were completely unprepared. They had already exhausted all the resources they had. And hence there was a need for external agencies to support them. So these house forms are called bungas. And what the minor technical modifications that were done by the local NGO was addition of a roughly 2% cement in the mud mixture for plastering of the walls, making the circle diameter slightly bigger so it could accommodate beds, removing the thatch and instead putting a pyramidal, not a pyramidal, but 5-sided roof with Mangalore tiles on it, and having hooks which connects the roof with the wall for cyclone. And as you can see, windows are really small because there are often dust storms in the area. And usually there are multiple rooms around a central platform. So the culturally sensitive layout of the house was retained as is. In another part of India, Gujarat, where there is a stone construction, another NGO mainly modified that technology slightly more and introduced these, as you can see, the triangular reinforced concrete slab for earthquake safety, and columns at all corners, and 3 bands of beams at ground level, at below the window, above the window, and at the roof level. This area also has a lot of cyclones, so as you can see, there's a little parapet above the roof on either side of the walls. And in case of Northeast India, which is at the foothills of Himalayas and has similar landmass as Bangladesh, so very riverine, flat alluvial plains, and the landmass constantly changes with the hydrology. There is abundance of bamboo and thatch. So as you can see in this image, this was the traditional house form. Every season, annual monsoonal rains would wash away these houses, and they would have to start again. So the local government, for the first time, had an extensive housing reconstruction strategy after floods. Typically, their response in the past was just to provide money to people and say, rebuild your house. But this time they said, no, we want to make the houses disaster resilient. So extensive training was done of local people, artisans collaborated with architects, engineers, local government members. And these two technologies were found most appropriate. Clay bricks and use of rat trap bonds. So having a cavity, but using least number of bricks to form that cavity. And the second was bamboo screen, like they were used to making traditionally, but plastering it with mud and cement mixture. Again, this area is prone to earthquakes, storm surges, and cyclones, and annual floods, of course. So an attic was made mandatory for any houses that were reconstructed after these floods. As you can see, the top above the attic, there is no plastering to allow for ventilation. All the walls had to have these diagonal bamboo members to have more strength, and each houses were built on lifted above ground and had to have pile foundation. But if you can imagine in areas where there is a high water table, it is very difficult to dig deep. The moment you dig, there would be a lot of water. So the water table was just 1 meter below ground. So local artisans, as you can see in this right-hand side image, they came up with the idea that let's use a barrel of oil, just put it in the center, and there is a person at the bottom in the barrel, and they are pulling out the water and passing out the water to someone standing above to create that hole. So a lot of innovations, innovative ideas were generated from the local people themselves because they knew their context really well. And piles were precast outside and then put in the ground. Bamboo construction was legalized and guidelines were developed for building out of bamboo. So over these 3 case studies that I examined, in Gujarat after the earthquake, these 2 places immediately after disaster, really resilient homes were created. I was interested in knowing whether people are replicating those technologies 10 years after media attention has gone away or NGOs have moved out. And in case of this settlement, people started changing the shape of the houses. And this may not be as earthquake resilient, and local people knew that, but they wanted to have square houses to accommodate mattresses and things like that. In the second settlement, the technology continued with all the resilient features, and that can be attributed mainly to a mason association formed locally by the NGO's support. And these masons were trained in international standards for earthquake-prone 5 region construction. So they have flown overseas to help other masons in training them how to build in earthquake-prone zones. In case of Bihar, it was too early to know what the long-term impacts would be, but these rat trap bond houses were being replicated. Based on the findings, I came up with this framework, and I won't go too much into detail of this, but it is very important to understand the housing in a broader systems context. and to develop a process and a reconstruction program that not only addresses the need of building a brick and mortar house, but also provide services or labor or whatever is essential. Sorry, I'll just keep a tab on my time. I'll just quickly go through the second one. Currently, I'm working in Honiara, Solomon Island, as a researcher. It's an action research project funded by UNFCCC Adaptation Fund, led by Professor Darren McAvoy. And my team is looking after nature-based solutions to urban space resilience. Now, these areas that are marked in color are the ones that are at high risk, either due to river or at the coastal region or at in high steep slope areas at risk of landslide. This is an image giving you an understanding. It's a hilly area, a rainforest meets the reef, that sort of context, and the houses are made out of natural materials like leaves and grass, but more modern ones where there's concrete piles and timber homes. So nature-based solutions lens was applied and an understanding was developed of how the urban development and disasters come in contact with the natural environment and what are the consequences. An operational framework was developed that lets define the problem, conduct ecosystem hazard and risk assessment, develop nature-based strategy, and then lead to financing and implementation. So we have gone through the first 3 stages. The third stage is still in process. This is when we went to Honiara and with these GIS-based and LiDAR-based maps, risk maps. The top one is showing slopes. The red ones are more than 45 degrees angle land. The bottom one is tsunami risk. We printed out large-scale maps and did this workshop with graduate students from Solomon Island National Institute to understand the cultural meaning of these disasters and risk. We came up with some design solutions with them, and at the same time, I took courses along with my colleagues, Yazid and Atta. They did studios as well with students in Australia, in Melbourne at RMIT, and came up with nature-based solutions to reducing landslide risk, to reducing the flow of water, and so that it doesn't take everything down with it. At the same time, provide food source for people and water. At Giant Grass, we participated in a competition to develop a climate resilient emergency shelter for Bangladesh. This design was shortlisted, which used local barrels and a technology where the floor would lift like a raft, and all the above floor was built out of bamboo. I think I should leave it there. There's my alarm. What my design, my research projects so far have focused on is either post-disaster reconstruction. Earlier, it focused on rural areas, but now more so on pre-disaster preparedness and building adaptive capacity in the Pacific and in Australian regional towns. So this project has just finished. The regional town of Australia, the houses are heritage listed, but majority of them do not comply with bushfire safety. standards because they were built before the codes existed. And together we came up, went through an extensive 2-year project where we co-produced an understanding of risk, of strengths, and developed an action plan of what needs to be done. And believe it or not, the top 5 priority actions, the first one was built environment and its safety. So now, in context of Western countries, it is in the hands of people themselves to be able to make these changes. And I'll leave you with this last slide as to developing a resilience action plan, or say designs, nature-based solutions designs in the Pacific, is just the very start of adaptation process. One needs to start implementing them and see whether it leads to the outcomes you're looking for, or make changes. And that is the transition phase, which is what will actually lead to transformation socially and ecologically, which is required for our long-term adaptation. So thank you for hearing me out. Over to you, Marcus and Jacob.
Thank you so much, Mitul. And we'll go ahead and jump right into Dr. Gupta's presentation.
Can you see my screen, the slides?
Not yet, Dr. Gupta.
Okay, let me just try again.
Something's happening now. Yep, there we go.
Can you see the slide share if I do? Can you see this? Sorry, not
Yeah.
the slide view?
Yes,
okay.
we can.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mitul, for that fascinating presentation, and also to the other speakers. So I'm going to take you from disaster resilience to a specific form of risk, which is heat. The key issue with heat is that we can't see it. And I think that itself is a problem, because we can't see it. Sometimes we don't realize how severe the risk can be. So broadly, I'll cover what is the problem, how can we solve it, and what are the case studies. Just before we start,
sorry, Dr. Gupta.
Yes.
Sincere apologies to interrupt, but your slides aren't showing anymore.
All right. Okay, let me try again. Are they showing now?
Yes.
Okay, good. And if I go ahead, can you see this? Our research on buildings and climate change?
Yep, we see the next slide. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I'll quickly give you an overview of what we've done. So we've been doing quite a bit of work in the area of buildings and climate change. I was involved in writing this report with UNEP on sustainable solutions for social housing. Did some work with UN Habitat and UNEP on green building interventions. And then I'm focusing quite a bit in India at the moment, where I've got a project which is looking at mainstreaming sustainable social housing in India. I've given the website, so when the slides are circulated, you can look at all the tools that we've developed for the design and construction of sustainable social housing. We're doing a very large project in India called Reside. We're trying to monitor energy use and indoor environment of around 2,000 homes in India to enable the evaluation of the energy code. We've also been looking at very closely the actual outcomes of green buildings in the Indian context, which is done very less to understand whether they actually perform, and if not, then why not. So those links you can look at later on. Coming straight into the challenge of heat waves and gradual increase in temperatures, I think everybody is now clearly aware that we see this on a daily basis. We know that heat waves and hot weather is predicted to rise, whether it's the intensity of it, whether it's the duration of it, or the frequency with the changing climate. We've seen what's happening around the world. We've seen what's happening across Europe, across South Asia, across very recently in the US and Canada, where temperatures are beginning to hit in the northwest to about 50 degrees Celsius, temperatures that haven't been witnessed, and those things are only going to become more commonplace. And I think it's also responsible for increasing number of deaths as well. We are also seeing, the rise of temperatures even in temperate climates, and that's also a worry. This gets even more exacerbated because of poor building design and operation, because the buildings are not designed to manage heat. We also have in cities what we call urban heat island effect, where you have higher temperatures in the city than the rural areas, and this can further be exacerbated by the housing density and the housing quality. So building design matters, and because the design, the systems themselves also get affected by heat. If there's one takeaway I want you to do from this presentation is this, diagram, which is this dynamic relation between people, climate, and buildings. We must not forget this as we try and adapt our buildings, because this relationship is what determines, how buildings perform and how they adapt and mitigate to a changing climate. Just to go through this a little bit, that people and buildings we know interact because people control the buildings to suit themselves in the climatic context. We know the building is, of course, modifying the climate to suit occupants within their cultural norms. The culture and preferences are partly determined by climate. We know that people's ensembles, clothing is determined by which climate they are in. And I think this is a fairly important dynamic relationship that should always be considered as we look for solutions for climate change adaptation to avoid not having the outcomes that we want to get out. Just to give you some kind of solutions, some of which we know, I think, and Mitul has also kind of alluded to those. Nature-based solutions are even important for building resilience to heat, which is great because you're doing multiple benefits almost. We know that the vulnerability of an individual building as well is influenced by the broader context. Large, access to public green-blue spaces, green-blue infrastructure, green roofs, all of those matter as we start to move towards a warming climate. And they also, as I said, nature-based solutions have a lot of other core benefits, not just for managing heat, but for flood management, drought management, even the well-being of residents, as we've realized in our national lockdowns, how important it is to have access to a good park to go for a walk. In terms of buildings themselves, after we've looked at the infrastructure, there is also, the building site and orientation that matters. We must not forget that we can arrange trees and other buildings to provide shading if we are, able to do new buildings, for example. Vegetation in buildings can also, help with wind flows for natural ventilation. We should try and minimize east-west facing wall lengths because the sun is either very low or very high, and it's quite difficult to cut that sun in the summer. So it's important to minimize, windows, for example, facing those orientations. Reflective surfaces matter. I'll talk a bit about that later on. I've got a case study as well, because that's a relatively easier way of reflecting heat away from the surface. Common or shaded walls reduce heat gain, which means row housing is actually a good thing, from a heat management point of view. Compact building forms matter. The technical term is really perimeter to area, and you should try and minimize that. Thermal mass helps, maybe in hot, dry climates. In certain climates, you want to have lightweight as well. If it's warm and humid, then you might want to dissipate heat quickly. But definitely, I would say in most climates, cross ventilation through shallow plans matter. And this is something which we are seeing coming to the foray because of COVID as well, but also being important for getting rid of indoor air pollutants, which are rising as well. So the other bit to be careful of is, there's growing movement about having homes on stilts now because it's protected from flooding as well, but also you can gather higher air flows at higher speeds. Wind speed, for instance, at 2 meters can be twice as fast as 1 meter, and it makes sense to raise them. There are also a single most measure, if I would say, that's effective for keeping the heat out as a passive measure is shading. External shading matters, whether that's adjustable shading or it's fixed shading, which might have some limitations, but still kind of does give the desired outcomes. And if you combine that with highly reflective walls and surfaces, you're going to be able to dissipate a lot of heat gain that would go away from the building and reduce thermal discomfort. So just to pick up a few case studies, this is a case study in India. It's an green affordable housing project in Chennai, so in the warm, humid climate of India. It was designed to maximize cross ventilation for comfort. So, and that's quite important because it was designed to minimize air conditioning usage. It has, a large number of flats, 604. We managed to do some actual studies, so performance studies, building performance evaluation of these flats. We conducted occupant surveys, across a number of flats. We also did some monitoring in one of the summer monsoon season in India, and it's been published. I've given the link so you can read all about it. I'll give you some headline findings because I think they're quite important to understand. So one of the things we found when we looked at energy was that one, despite the intent of keeping it cross-ventilated, some people installed air conditioning units, but not all used them. That's because it's affordable housing after all. And what we found was, despite having these units, there were long periods of time when the AC flats were naturally ventilated. And where they were used, you had a rise of about 32% more energy on an annual basis. But what's interesting is, despite more energy being used, the indoor temperatures in naturally ventilated flats, as compared to flats which are air conditioning units, did not have much of a difference. So there was only 0.2 degrees difference between the measured indoor temperatures, which means that actually the cross ventilation strategy was working well. So if you look at this, this graph, you can see that they're quite similar. If I removed that line of AC and naturally ventilated, you wouldn't be able to kind of differentiate the two. And that's quite important. People also, we surveyed them and got their actual experiences, are very positive about the development. They don't find it dry and they don't find it humid, so that's good. It's somewhere in between. The temperature variation, which can be a big problem in some of the naturally ventilated buildings, was not there. Actually, it's considered to be pretty. The green means it's a good thing, and they're considered to be pretty stable. Another case study from a shading point of view, this is in Vietnam, where the vernacular design, imposes large openings facing the south, both to enhance daylight and natural ventilation. There are louvers and shutters which shade the openings, as you can see, and their two-layered window provides flexible and operable control during both hot and cold periods. The front corridor itself acts like a buffer to the inner space from both the sun and heavy rain. And it's again painted white, so you can reflect a lot of heat as well. And then the case study 3 is in India, which is looking at cool surfaces. I think that's a growing area now across the world to dissipate heat. This is in Ahmedabad and Hyderabad, where there's a cool roof initiatives going on, and especially for protecting low-income communities from extreme heat. Measurements have shown that actually you can reduce average temperatures by about 2 degrees indoors if you have cool roofs, as compared to homes without cool roofs. That's substantial reduction, and that could kind of avoid thermal discomfort as well. And also, when you kind of look at the trial group of residents, most of them, 3/4 of them expressed satisfaction with the cool roofs. And clearly that's seen as a good solution, both from a technical perspective and also from a people perspective. So there are a number of these solutions, whether you apply it, as a neighborhood solution or as an infrastructure solution or at a building level solution as well. And some of the stuff that I'm showing is very much on the measurement side to show that actually some of these things do work in reality. So final thoughts, I think Jacob did kind of allude to it, but in the context of building resilience to heat, I think these are really important, because heat management, as I said, is not visible. So you are almost tackling something which you don't see. So keeping paying attention to the needs of inhabitants and users is necessary, because otherwise most of the solutions will probably not work. I think from a resilience to heat perspective, we must learn to design for a future climate. At the moment, you would be surprised that most of the modeling that's done is for a past climate, which is really not correct, because buildings last about 50 to 60 years. We also need to adopt a life cycle approach to building design, because buildings last a long time, and if you don't do that, then decisions made today will be locked in for the life of the building, and even at the end of its life. Again, Jacob had alluded to this, but again, locally rooted design and construction solutions must be encouraged, even for building resilience to heat. And I think this is where really governments matter. Individual action is necessary and important, but is not a substitute for government policy and action. If we want to do adaptation at scale, I think we must have the will of the government and policymakers. And I think one of the things that we can do is to share good practice as much as bad practice to ensure that we are learning from both sides of the coin. I think I'm going to stop here because I've also run out of time. And so over to you, Jacob and Marcus.
So Jacob, can you see the slide?
Yes. Yes, Marcus. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for the very interesting presentation. It's most appreciated. We're a touch behind time, so if everyone can stay an extra 10 minutes, that would be wonderful. We'll move into the question and answer session. So as you have questions or comments even, please enter them into the chat and I will moderate. Let's go ahead and begin with one of the questions regarding the solutions that are proposed in some of these case studies or have been implemented. How do you identify that they're resilient to risks? Is there lab testing? Do you do kind of a mock-up, or in some of your projects, Dr. Mitul, for example, the cross bracing with the bamboo? How is that solution identified?
A very good question. In case of Gujarat, there was for earthquake safety, there was a shake table test done. So in front of all the local people, a small-scaled house was built by the local artisans, and Japanese earthquake test measure people. There's a company who does that. They were also invited. They did shake table testing and developed a video, which the government of Gujarat, the state government of Gujarat, used on their website to show it to everyone. So for earthquake, it's there is pre-established methods, as in shake table tests. But for flood, there isn't any such measure to suggest what will work and what will not. But based on their previous over 15 years of experience, these NGOs developed these designs collaboratively with the local people and learning from vernacular architecture. And it has stood test of time. Almost every year since 2008, I have been checking with these local communities and the social workers there. Those houses have withstood massive floods. So I hope this answers your question.
Most definitely. Thank you very much. Dr. Gupta, I'll turn to you, but I'm going to add a second question, and that is there a role for this testing or this science-based policy in changing the minds of the local regulators so that these measures, like, for example, in one of the examples from Dr. Vanavati, the allowance for bamboo as a building material, or some of the transitions and changes in social housing that you've worked with. So if you don't mind addressing that question.
Yes, no, definitely. I think what we are doing here, both I think Mitul and myself are doing something called living lab approach. We are trying to test things in the real world with real people in real settings. And that gives evidence to local policymakers and also confidence that these things may work when they are scaled up. Local regulators, depending upon the country that we're talking about, do have some control over local planning policies, for example. And I think these kind of projects offer that evidence to them to be able to roll these out to other developments, because there is a go-to place, there are tests happening. Some things will work and some things will not work. But because we are driving this through a science-based approach, there's more confidence. And because I think both approaches, whether it's for disaster resilience or for heat management, are very user-centric, the chances of user acceptance is pretty high in this, because you keep the users right in the center when you're trying to do this. So I would say yes, if you kind of follow this approach, then local regulators too will have more confidence. And the other thing I would stress is both of us come from universities, and that's another evidence that if you work with local universities, we tend to bring that independence and impartiality to projects, which I think should be encouraged in different parts of the world. And that also brings that community, industry, policy making, and academia kind of collaboration, which is necessary.
Thank you so much. Dr. Vanavati, many of your examples were kind of more rural areas. And I'm wondering the role and the challenge of engaging the local government to more directly participate with these risk mitigation strategies in the rural communities. What are some strategies that you've seen work well for getting a change in the government paradigm on disaster and raising political will for these types of activities?
Yes, there are three strategies that come to mind, but I'll mainly talk about two. One, when I was doing my PhD, and I came across one NGO group, they sort of started forming a consortium of NGOs. So instead of competing with each other, when I say NGO, I mean non-government organizations. So instead of competing against each other, they formed a consortium that let's work with each other and at a whole regional scale. They kind of stood against the government policy, which was imposing people to move from their existing location to another location because it was highly at risk of earthquakes. But people said we should be able to make that decision for ourselves. Don't impose it on us. And government had to change that policy. Just because these NGOs stood next to these local people, they brought in lawyers and other people who could translate what local communities wanted into a language and into a manner that government would listen to. So yes, government had to change the policy, the whole state level policy, because of these few NGOs and stood by the people. Second is that was in rural context. Now I'll give you an example from urban context. Currently, I am working on developing shelter guide for urban informal settlements in Solomon Island. To develop this guide, which will be endorsed by the shelter cluster, the global shelter cluster, it will be followed by all the humanitarian organizations who intend to work in Solomon Islands. And for this, we need government goodwill. So from the very onset of this project, we have developed a main advisory committee. The local Ministry of Land from disaster management team, they are part of this committee. They will be key stakeholders who has to be on board, or all the shelter advice or guidance we provide will have to come from them as well as from the community. It's not like me saying that I'm an expert. I'm saying, you tell me based on your vernacular adaptation. You tell me based on your administrative experience in the government. And let's bring all these experiences together. And we have people from shelter cluster like Red Cross who are also on advisory panel. So I am here to mainly bring it all together and bring in my knowledge too, but it is all informed by the people and the government. So we are I'm kind of in between the people and the government. And I think that will be another excellent example of government saying that, yes, please tell us what people want. So we have this guidance with us before any major disaster happens, and hence we know what to do that people will accept. So they are already on board with us.
Thank you so much. I see there are a couple other questions, but we're a bit pressed on time. There was 2 questions on cost, and that to give you the short answer on that, that's going to be so country or location specific, it'll be hard to give an answer. And also because the report touches on so many different approaches, that it's hard to provide a cost. Some are no cost. I mean, we're talking just turning the building on the, if you're building a new building, turning it slightly so it's facing the sun differently. But Dr. Gupta's publications, you'll have access to those via the presentations that will be shared afterwards. So I want to thank all the other authors for the excellent answers and for all of you for asking some great questions. Marcus, I'll turn it over to you or Ava to conclude. And then if people would like to stick around after the conclusion, we'll try to show the animation one more time. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jacob, and thank you, Mitul and Rajat. So we are now reaching the end of the event. We are already a few minutes late. Sorry if we were not able to address all the questions, but hopefully a lot of them will be answered by the report itself. For any questions from media, please contact Marcus Nield. His email address is on the slide right now. And to know more about UNEP's work on adaptation, you can visit UNEP's Climate Adaptation Resource and Multimedia website. You will see that appear on your slide, and the link will also be shared through the chat. So we had a large turnout today, so I want to thank all participants for joining us. We were very happy to launch this report with you today. And I also want to give a big thank to our speakers today and all of those who made the launch of this report possible, including the authors of the report and also the communication team. So thank you very much for the great work. We will try to screen the video again. So for those of you who wish and who can stay with us a few more minutes, we will do that now. For the others, thank you very much. Have a great end of day and enjoy the rest of the Asia Pacific Climate Week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll start the video now.
The global climate is changing, and people everywhere are feeling the heat, and the increasing storms, and the rising floodwaters. These disastrous climate change impacts are especially severe for those living in developing countries. But our homes and our buildings can provide refuge from climate disasters. In fact, investing in well-designed, resilient buildings is one of the best ways of adapting to climate change. It can save, quite literally, trillions of dollars worth of damages. Let's look at some examples. Rising temperatures are leading to more heat waves and droughts, which impacts the soil and can damage foundations and building materials. Extended periods of heat also increase the likelihood of fire, posing a risk to people and their homes. To adapt, we can position buildings to capture the winds. Outer walls can be strategically built to channel cooling breezes indoors. Crucially, nature offers additional solutions. Plants can be grown around a building to provide shade, reducing indoor temperatures and making interior spaces more comfortable. Specific species, such as tall palms, are often an excellent choice, blocking the sun while allowing welcome breezes to pass through. Climate change is whipping up more intense storms, including cyclones and hurricanes, wreaking havoc on coastal communities. Buildings can be modified from the ground up into more wind-resistant shapes. Roofs can be redesigned with multiple slopes that perform better under wind forces. Connections between the walls and the roof can be reinforced with better, more secure attachments. Again, nature can provide solutions. Coastal ecosystems such as mangrove forests reduce wind speeds. They also limit coastal flooding, caused by storm surges, as they can absorb the energy of the waves. Climate change is leading to unpredictable rainfall patterns in many parts of the world, resulting in floods that destroy homes. Since the start of the century, floods have affected more than 2 billion people. Again, we must rethink from the ground up. Homes in floodplains can be elevated on stilts, allowing floodwaters to pass underneath. Building materials must be properly chosen and matched to the site conditions, which will help the home stay drier. Nature can help too, especially if we restore floodplain ecosystems, which protect communities by acting like a sponge that retains water and absorbs it into the ground. The specific solutions to heat waves, storms and floods must fit local conditions, but the key step toward resilience are the same. Here's the blueprint. First, buildings should be erected on a strong foundation of laws, government policies and building codes wherever possible. Second, those buildings must be structured with knowledge that combines the wisdom of local communities with the latest data from scientists. And third, we must incorporate solutions from the natural world in building climate-resistant communities. When grey building solutions are combined with green natural solutions, resilient communities emerge, poised to meet new challenges ahead.
Great, it worked. Thank you everyone. Thank you and have a great day. Bye everyone.